A client I recently worked with was in a situation that a lot of real estate investors eventually find themselves in. He had a property that he wanted to keep. He had built up equity in that property, but wanted to buy another property as well. There was just one problem though. He didn't have enough cash available for the next purchase. And he didn't want to sell the property that he already had, so he felt a little bit stuck. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. Because if you're building a real estate portfolio, there are ways to use equity you've already created to help you acquire your next property without automatically being forced to sell the one you have already. One of the biggest challenges investors often face is this: you buy a property, it appreciates, you pay down the mortgage, and you've built equity. But that doesn't necessarily help you buy your next property unless you have a way to access that equity. And this is where sometimes investors get caught. They often think I have two or $300,000 of equity, but I don't have enough cash for another down payment. So the problem isn't necessarily they don't have the wealth to buy the next property. It's that their wealth is tied up in the property they already have. So the first question to ask is this: do you want to sell your property, or do you simply need to access some of the equity you've already built up? Those are two very different problems. Let's say you own a rental property that's worth approximately 600,000 and you only owe around 250,000. So that's approximately 350,000 in equity. However, that equity is sitting inside wrapped up in the property. So, if your goal is to build a portfolio, that equity can potentially become a source of capital. Depending on your situation, that could mean a cash out refinance, a HELOC, or maybe another type of financing strategy designed to access the equity you need. The important point is this: you don't necessarily need to sell an asset to make the equity in that asset work for you. And that's exactly the problem that we were trying to solve for my client here recently. The goal for my client wasn't just getting the cash, it was keeping the property. And this is where I think investors need to be careful. If you have a good rental property, selling it just because you need capital for the next investment may not always be the right choice or decision for your situation. Maybe that property is producing good cash flow. Maybe you bought it years ago and maybe you have favorable interest rates on it. Maybe you simply believe that the property is one you want to own for the next 10 to 20 years. My client's objective wasn't, how do I get rid of this property? It was, how do I keep the property and still acquire the next one? That changes your conversation completely. Instead of looking at the existing property as something you must sell, we can look at it as an asset that may be able to help fund the next stage of your portfolio growth. This is where leverage can become an important wealth building tool. I want to make an important distinction here, though. I'm not saying that every investor should borrow against their property. Leverage can magnify returns, but it can also magnify losses. So, this isn't about borrowing as much money as possible. It's about understanding whether or not the numbers make sense for you. For example, if you can access equity from property one and use that capital towards property two, you now have two assets working together towards your long term wealth building goals. However, instead of selling property one to fund property two, you have to be sure that borrowing against property one makes sense to purchase property two. So you need to look at the entire picture. What does the payment on property two look like? What does the expected rental income on property two look like? And what's your cash flow look like on that property as well? Also, what's your overall debt to income situation and qualifications look like with both properties added in? Another factor: how much equity are you going to leave in your original property? And will that leave you with an adequately cash flowing asset as well? So, you need to consider, does the investment still make sense after the additional debt is added? Those are the factors that matter most in this decision making process. There may be more than one way to solve a problem like this. And this is the part that I think gets overlooked the most. When an investor says, I don't have enough money to buy another property, That doesn't necessarily mean the answer is you need to find more money. Sometimes the answer is let's look at the assets you already own. There may be several ways to approach it. You could potentially use a cash out refinance, or maybe you could use a HELOC of some kind, or potentially restructure the debt in some way to your advantage. Or, depending on the overall borrower's qualifications and situation available to them, there may be other financing options available. And that was the case for the client I worked with here recently. For example, we used a program called the Wealth Builder. I used this program to solve my client's need for access to equity without selling the property. This is a first lien HELOC program designed to be used on investment properties. The important thing, though, isn't the product in this situation. The important thing is that we found a way to access the equity without forcing my client to sell a property that he wanted to keep, and found a way to now have two cash flowing properties going forward. So ultimately, there's solutions that work for every individual borrower or buyer, and those solutions may not always be the same for everybody. So instead of just saying, I need to sell my existing property, we looked at the equity my client had already created. We looked at how much capital he needed, and we looked at the payment and overall investment strategy that worked best for him. We found a financing solution that allowed him to keep his existing property while moving forward with the next purchase. That's a completely different conversation than I don't have enough cash, so I guess I can't buy another property. If you're an investor who is sitting on a significant amount of equity, but feel like you're stuck because you don't have enough liquid reserves to purchase your next property, don't automatically assume that selling the property is your only option. Start with these three questions. How much equity do I actually have? How much capital do I actually need for the next investment property? And is there a financing strategy that makes sense that will allow me to access the equity I need while still keeping the property and allowing adequate cash flow on that property as well? Sometimes the key to buying your next investment property isn't selling the one you already own. It's figuring out how to make the equity in the property work best for you. If you're an investor trying to figure out how to finance your next investment property, that's exactly the scenario I like to work with. I would love to hear from you and help you devise your strategies going forward. Please reach out for help.